So let's talk about Nansen's cat in particular. Now, this passage is from page 71 of Suzuki, where he describes the story. He says, "In the monastery of Nansen, monks of the eastern wing quarreled with those of the western wing over the possession of a cat. The master seized it, and lifting it before the disputing monks, said, 'If any of you can say something to save the poor animal, I will let it go.' As no one came forward to utter a word of affirmation, Nansen cut the object of dispute in two, thus putting an end forever to an unproductive quarreling over yours and mine. Later on, Joshu came back from an outing, and Nansen put the case before him, and asked him what he would have done to save the animal. Joshu, without further ado, took off his straw sandals, and putting them on his head, went out. Seeing this, Nansen said, 'If you were here at the time, you would have saved the cat.'" What a bizarre story, isn't it? So, why would Joshu's actions have saved the cat? In what way can we think about this story so that that makes sense? And I say it in that way for a specific reason. Makes sense. Is it logical sense that we're trying to make of this? I mean, clearly not. When we think about someone's actions as appropriate, surely the actions have some bearing on the matter at hand. So, given that Joshu putting his sandals on his head must have something true about it, something substantive about it, something that relates to the matter at hand, then this would help to make sense of the story. Well, I'm using true in a metaphorical sense here necessarily. How can we do this? In what way does the putting of one's sandals on one's head and walking out, why is that response sensible? What is it that compels someone to do this? You see, a lot of what we get in Zen is very spontaneous. And there's a certain sense in which one must be spontaneous, and spontaneous in the right way, whatever right means, something that is appropriate to the challenge, the question that's being asked. And one must respond almost instinctively in the right way to present a reasonable solution to the problem. And this is not something that we're going to get to by normal logical means. We're not going to be able to look at the action of putting his sandals on his head or the action of the quarrel of the cat and the slaying of the cat. We're not going to be able to look at those details and connect anything there. There's simply no connection to be had in that way. So if there is something natural and good about about Joshu's response to Nansen's question, then it must lie at a different level than that of logical sense and any kind of claim or truth in the way that we're accustomed to thinking about it. And so this is really part of the challenge, and this is why this is offered as a koan, because it invites us to try and understand what frame of mind, what kind of thinking is appropriate to understanding that sort of situation, and how is it that we can not only wrap our minds around to find out how it works, because that's really not the point, but change our way of thinking so that we embody more of what Joshu did, so that there is more Zen in our actions, so to speak. And this is a substantial challenge, and it really offers a very fundamental challenge, and I think Suzuki is right to point this out, to our traditional Western ways of thinking. And so any kind of comparative approach is really going to have a challenge in dealing with things like this, because what material are you going to compare? If you're going to take Zen and set it aside some of the other major religions of the world, You don't have gods. You don't have doctrine in the same way. You do have practices, which is interesting, but it's hard to say exactly what those practices are for because they're not rituals in the same way. So in Zen, though you have certain meditative practices that are more effective than others, these are training practices. They're not rites like the Eucharist in Christianity. The rite is not prior to the person, in other words. And what I mean by that is this. The Eucharist has significance in and of itself, and it's not just for the individual, by a certain interpretation at least. And with many of the rites in Christianity, they are not just for the psychological betterment of the individual, because if this were the only concern, then one could replace them with other rites and it would be just as good. So you would want to have a competition to determine which ones are best and then use those. That's what's done in Zen. The collection of koans are collections of sayings, of questions, and practices that are useful. And they're useful because they were effective. So these are the stories that people found to be the most useful. This isn't the way that Scripture works in Christianity or a variety of other religions with which we are familiar. And so the tradition that we get in Zen is one that is much more practically focused in the sense that any kind of tangible artifact that we get from Zen in terms of koans, books, writings, practices, a mat that one sits on for meditation, the halls, the temples, and these sorts of things, they're really bent towards a particular end. They are practical tools and do not have much to offer us outside of that. So there's very little substance that we can use to compare, which is interesting to us. And this really presents a challenge to us to try and understand just how different the thinking really is in Zen and in the East generally, for which Zen is for us kind of an emblematic religious practice. So that's what I would encourage you to think about when you're hearing Suzuki's stories, many of which are koans. So when you hear about someone coming to a master over and over again and repeatedly asking all these detailed questions, and the master either hitting him or just putting him off or whatever it is, and then one day knocking him off of a balcony and he goes crashing down into the ground below, and by the time he hits the ground he's enlightened. Well, how do we make sense of that sort of thing? A master puts a water bucket in the front of the community, and someone goes up and kicks the water bucket over. Why is that helpful? What is it about the actions and those stories that are helpful and that are interesting? Now, I want to juxtapose the koans with something also of interest to us, and it's the practice of haiku. Now, haiku is something that is nicely juxtaposed, I think, with koans, because with haiku, what we have is a very brief and encapsulated nugget of experience, a kind of whiff of experience. And a really good haiku is one that really gets at the what it's like to experience something, to be somewhere. And so the stronger that is, really the more powerful the little poem. And that kind of effect is not something that is contained in any one of the words. It's not contained in any one of the concepts. It's not contained in the structure. It's not part of any kind of claim, or if you try and translate a haiku or summarize it for someone, it loses its effect. And so there is something peculiar and powerful about the specific arrangement of ideas and images in the haiku that makes it work. And we might say the same thing for music, even in a Western context. So a string of notes that together constitute one of Mozart's themes, looking at each individual note is really not going to be all that terribly helpful. And maybe even looking at the relation. I mean, if we look at the relation between all the different notes, we might have some sense of what's going on. Maybe it's within, true to a particular scale, maybe not. Maybe there's an accidental thrown in there, and it may not be obvious why. But it's unlikely that we're going to be able to really fully explicate what the melody is and how it works, why the melody is so powerful by doing an analysis of it in this way. And so, just like haiku, and then just like the koans, there is something about the presentation of these little stories, just as there is with the presentation of a musical melody or a haiku, that has power altogether. So the whole package of the thing has power. And it's an interesting question for us to look into, to ask why it is that it should have power. Why it is that this little nugget of experience should have some appeal to us. And perhaps the example of music is unfortunate in certain regards, because music is something that we find beautiful. We don't, no one asks, our brain doesn't ask us permission to be able to find something beautiful. In other words, we don't control what we find beautiful. And we don't control the kind of music that we like. You can try to acquire a taste for something, but the visceral reaction of I feel this is a really powerful piece, or it just doesn't speak to me, is not something that you can want to have happen and will to happen in that way. You can't artificially create that experience. And the same kind of thing goes here. So how deeply the analogy goes, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, that's much of what we're trying to get to by looking at the koans.